Now, when you become a parent, there are so many things that nobody ever tells you about having kids. It's kind of like a crash course with your first one. How many of you felt that way when you had kids of your own? You did your best, you read the books, you talked to those that had kids, but the truth is, people can tell you the basics, but beyond that, it's just an adventure. Every time your kid or your kids move into another stage together, it's almost like driving blind just a little bit till you see what the next stage holds for you. And I know there are many things that I was unprepared for as a parent, but one of the ones most recently that's really been alive for me, I was unprepared for just how many times, the sheer number of times that I would have to play referee in my own household. Parents, do you understand what I mean by that? Just the sheer number of times that I would have to break up fights and arbitrate and be judge, jury, and sometimes executioner when a situation was happening. Every day almost, my kids will come to me, and Nate or Audrey, they will come and they will say, "Dad," it kind of has an arc to it. There's a whiny tone to it. It's a special dad. There's the happy dad, and then there's the dad, "I beseech thee for something. I need justice in my own life." It's, "Dad, Nate did this," or "Audrey did this," or "It's my turn for the headphones," or "It's my turn to watch TV," and over and over and over again. And sometimes I don't even get to wake up in the morning before this begins. Just last week, I heard a fight brewing in the kitchen, and it was a fight over mini-wheats nonetheless. It was a fight over the very last bowl of mini-wheats. Seriously, 50 cents worth of cereal. And as the ardor just kept growing and the noise kept growing from my bed, I could hear them fighting, and this is what happened. One of them knew there was only one bowl left of mini-wheats, so they hid it in the other room. So when they woke up in the morning, the other person wouldn't see it, and then they would bring it back and eat it, which is, by the way, very clever. I was proud of them. That's good ingenuity. That's good forethought. And so they hid it in the other room. And then when the other found out, all hell broke loose in our kitchen. And I am lying there in bed, and sometimes before I even get out, I can hear this happening, and I feel like just getting up and putting on a referee's stripes and grabbing my whistle and going to work. That's what it feels like some mornings. Like I got to walk into the kitchen, I got to check the instant replay camera and make a call as to who's right and who's wrong in this situation. Do you know what they ended up doing with this last bowl of mini-wheats? They ended up dividing them by counting them one by one. And sure enough, I kid you not, when they got to the very last one, there was an odd number of mini-wheats. What did they do with the very last one? They cut it in half. It's all about fairness, right? We have to be fair with each and every last little tidbit and morsel, because you would think we were starving by the way they did this. It happens so often that there are times that I have read in Proverbs and 1 Kings, I feel like going the Solomon route and just buying a sword and saying, "Okay, let's just start cutting stuff in half here. You both want to watch TV? Let's cut it in half. You can each have half of the TV. Then we'll see who loves TV more." The truth is, these things happen over and over again, and some of you parents, some of you hard-nosed parents, you're sitting there listening to me, you're just such a softie. Just let them work it out themselves. Let them take care of things all by themselves. Everything will be fine. I tried that, and apparently when there's no sheriff in town, everybody shoots each other. At least this happens in my house. The mini-wheats go flying, and everybody gets handsy, and all things fall out of control. I had no idea becoming a parent just how many times I would have to be the judge and the jury, how many times I would have to be the investigator and the detective, how many times I'd have to be a body language expert to see who was telling the truth and who was lying when something broke out. Now, the one phrase that I hear over and over again more than any other ones, let's see if you've heard this one before. "Dad, it's not fair." So you've heard this one too, have you? "Dad, this isn't fair. You're not being fair with me. This isn't fair how you're dividing this up. Our time isn't fair. The game isn't fair. Dad, this isn't fair." You see, right from a very early age, every single one of us, every person actually has an inbuilt sense of right and wrong, and every one of us has an inbuilt sense of justice inside of us. And when something happens and a situation takes place where we don't feel like we are being dealt with fairly or dealt with justly, something rises up within us. There's a piece of us that goes, "Hey, this isn't right. This isn't the way it was supposed to be. Something is wrong here." Now, this is the same feeling that you feel when your team is in the playoffs and the ref makes a bad call and all of a sudden your team loses the game. You ever had this happen before? It's the same feeling you feel every time you watch CSI and the bad guy gets away, or when you cheer when he gets caught. It is a sense of justice that is deep within every human soul. Now, the truth is, it's not really well calibrated sometimes because we're a whole lot louder about justice for ourselves than we are about the other person beside us, aren't we? If we're being honest. When the referee makes a bad call against us, we're up in arms and our hands in the air. When he makes a bad call against the other team, we kind of count the ceiling tiles or look around somewhere else, right? Our sense of justice, it may not be well calibrated, but the truth is it is there inside every single one of us. And you know what the truth is? This feeling will never go away as long as you live. It is there deep inside all of us, and it will be there until the day you die. Do you know why this feeling is there? This feeling is there because God put it there inside of you. This sense about right and wrong and the sense about when things are being fair and unfair is a sense that God has put of His very self inside of us. And you know what? It's not just about us feeling that way when we get left out or when we get hard done by. We feel this for other people sometimes too. When we feel somebody else is being taken advantage of or somebody else is being steamrolled, there's a sense of justice within us that churns and stirs. And the reason why it is there is that God put it there inside each and every one of us. This isn't just your conscience. This is a sense inside of you that the world ought to be in some way fair for each and every person. Do you all know what that feeling feels like? Have you felt that feeling before? Now, the thing about justice is it's not just us who cares about justice. God cares about it too. It's not just us who has a sense of when things should be fair and not. God actually passionately cares about justice. And here's the crazy thing to think about. No matter how upset you get when a situation is unfair, did you know that God gets even more upset than you do? When something isn't equally being shared as something more than mini-wheats here about big life situations, when something isn't equally being done by or somebody is left out or forced out, God cares about the situations even more than you or I do. So no matter how upset you may be about a missed opportunity or about a situation where you were passed over at work or something that happens, God cares even more passionately about these things that you and I do. And here's how I know. God actually built His kingdom upon it. I want to read for you from Psalm 89, verse 14. This is what it says. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, O God. Love and faithfulness go before you. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, O God, and unfailing love and faithfulness go before you. That's a cool picture, isn't it? That God built His throne, that God built His kingdom, the seat by which He judges and maintains and sustains all of humanity and all of the cosmos. God built His throne upon two pillars. What are they? Righteousness and justice. He actually constructed His world and His kingdom and the future upon these two things, righteousness and justice. And I just love that. And He pictures His right and His left-hand man as love and faithfulness going before Him. And if you've been reading through Proverbs with me, if you've been following along, you realize that the book of Proverbs talks over and over again about this thing called justice. It talks over and over again about how we treat each other, about how we deal with one another, about how governments and individuals interact with each other. And it's not just the book of Proverbs. It is all over the Bible, starting in Genesis and not ending all the way into the book of Revelation, where God promises that the future world that He is creating will be a world completely and purely made of justice. That nothing ever will be unfair, that nothing ever will go wrong. And if you read the book of Proverbs over and over again, Solomon is calling you and he is calling me to tell us to live our lives and to call us to live our lives with this sense of integrity and justice in everything we do and in everyone that we meet. What he does in Proverbs is he calls us to listen to that voice that he has placed inside each and every one of us and to do what he has called us to do, to leverage it for those who aren't getting justice, to speak up for those who aren't being heard, to be the voice that some people don't have because of where they have been placed in the world that they live in. You see, that voice and that feeling that you have inside you, it is there for a reason, and the reason is that God wants you to act on it, to live by it, and to speak for others from Him. So let's back up just a little bit and let's talk about what justice is before we start talking about how to live it out. In the Bible, there are two words for justice. There are two words that in the Old Testament especially get used over and over again to describe what God is talking about when He calls us to live a life of justice. The first is tzedakah, and the second is mishpat. Hebrew's a cool language. How many of you would agree with that? Hebrew's just a really neat language to listen to. When I was in Israel, sometimes I would just turn the TV on and watch them do the news in Hebrew. Couldn't understand a word that they were saying, but I just loved to listen to him. There are even some people that say in heaven we will all speak one language, and that one language will be Hebrew. And I have no idea if that's true or not, but I'll tell you this much. It's a neat language. And in so much of our faith is rooted in the Old Testament language of Hebrew. And so the first word, we're going to learn a little Hebrew this morning. The first word for justice in the Bible is tzedakah. Why don't you say that with me? Tzedakah. Tzedakah means primary justice. It means living fairly. It means giving everyone in your life and in the world around you equal and fair treatment regardless of who they are or where they grow up or how much money they do or don't have or who they are connected to. It means treating every human being on planet Earth with an equal sense of fairness and justice. When you were in kindergarten, they taught you the golden rule. Do you still remember the golden rule? Do you remember what it is? To treat others as you want to be treated. If you boil it down, the Hebrew word for tzedakah is very close to that. It is to treat everyone the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their shoes and if you were in that situation. Sometime in the Old Testament, it refers to charity, where we are generous with the extra that we have for those who have less, but it's more than just charity. It is about leveling the playing field and living your life and the people around you on an equal plane where each person gets treated equally and fairly. This is a big issue in our culture right now, isn't it? This is a hypersensitive issue in our culture, and truthfully, God is on the forefront of justice because He believes that every single one of us has innate human rights because we were made in God's image, and we have the right to be treated equally. Sometimes the church doesn't get represented this way, but God is on the forefront of this. This is what Hebrew calls tzedakah. But there is a second word that talks about justice in the Old Testament, and it is the word mishpat. Why don't you say that with me? Mishpat. You're getting close. You're all Hebrew scholars, just a little bit this morning. It's the word mishpat, and basically what mishpat means, it means fixing what's already been wronged. It means taking a situation where somebody has been stolen from or cheated out of, or something has happened to them where they got steamrolled by someone who was in a larger position who had more authority than they did, and it was wrong, and fixing that situation in which they are done wrong. It's not just about living your life fairly, it's about things have happened and things have been broken and going back and restoring those things and fixing those things and making right what the enemy or the world or the flesh have broken and taken advantage of. And all throughout Proverbs, it calls us to this thing called mishpat, which means to stick up for those who can't stick up for themselves, to make right those who have been wronged. And there are four groups of people that talk about in the Bible all the time. They call them the quartet of the oppressed. It is widows, it is orphans, it is the fatherless, and it is the poor. This is the quartet of the vulnerable. People in Old Testament society, especially that were the most vulnerable to being taken advantage of. God calls us in the Old Testament to look out for these people who can't speak for themselves. Do you know those news stories where a big company comes in and steamrolls all the little people, and then afterwards the courts make them pay fines of hundreds of millions of dollars? Have you all seen stories like that? One of them's happening in the States right now. Do you know what that is? That's mishpat. It's making right something that was wrong. Now, the cool thing about these two words is if we were to do the first one, we wouldn't need to do the second one. Does that make sense to all of you? If we were to all to begin with by treating each other fairly and living in a world where we equally deal with every single person, we wouldn't need to make any wrongs right. We wouldn't need to fix any broken things because we are living a life of fair and equitable treatment. But the truth is, we don't live in a world like that, do we? How much news do you have to watch to figure out what kind of a world we live in? 5 minutes? Just to read the headlines in the morning, you realize that our world isn't fair. So God calls us as followers of Jesus, as faithful followers of His, to do two things. To do tzedakah, to live fairly in our own world, and to do mishpat, which is to look out for those who have been oppressed and to make things right where they have been wrong. Are you with me so far? These are the two halves of biblical justice. Now, what I love about Proverbs is Proverbs takes, and Solomon takes all of these words and all of these images and all of these truths, and he puts flesh on them, and he gives us not just a picture, but a map of what justice looks like in real life. He takes these concepts and he gives them and he airdrops them into real life situations that you and I can actually learn from and practice in our everyday lives on Monday morning and Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning. And the reason why this is so important to me is because a lot of us, we have been left out of this equation, and we don't talk about justice enough in the church because for most of us, we feel like there is nothing we can do about the big problems in the world, so why bother? Honestly, how many of you have ever felt like that? How many of you watched the news and thought, what in the world can I do about that thing that's happening in Africa? What in the world can I do about that thing that's happening in South America? The rainforest is burning right now. What can I do? What can I do about what's happening in China? What can I do about all of these other places? We get this sense of paralyzed apathy because we don't think that there is anything that we can do about the world's big problems. John Mayer wrote a song years ago. It was called Waiting on the World to Change. Have you heard that song before? Waiting on the world to change. And the fundamental emotion behind that song is the feeling of the generation that I grew up in saying, the world is so broken and so messed up that there is nothing I can do to fix that, so I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait on the world to change. But you know what? Solomon and God, they have a very different prescription for what's wrong in the world, and you don't have to be a CEO. You don't have to be a politician. You don't have to be a big landowner. All you have to be is a faithful follower of Jesus and someone who is willing to obediently do 4 things to restore a sense of justice in the world that you live in. How many of you would like to do that? How many of you are interested in becoming an agent of change in the world that you live in right now and actually causing justice to spread instead of to shrink and to make a difference in the sphere of influence that you have? Every human being has a sphere of influence. Did you know that? Every one of you in this room has a sphere of influence. You have relationships and people that you talk to. You have places where they listen to you. You have places where you can affect change. Every one of you has a sphere of influence. As God is calling you to restore justice in the realm to which you can control. Through 4, I'm not going to say easy things, but 4 powerful things. Are you interested? So let's dive in. The first one is this: fix. Fix your scales. If you want to be a person of justice, if you want to follow Jesus and you want to make a difference in the world that you live in, it doesn't start out there. Where does it start? It starts right here. You got to fix your own scales. I want to read for you Proverbs 11:1, and we're going to jump forward 2 verses here. The Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him. The Lord detests is another word for hates, dishonest scales. If God says he hates something, should we pay attention? The Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him. Move on to Proverbs 20. Differing weights and differing measures, the Lord what? Detests them both. And on to 17. Food gained by fraud tastes sweet, but one ends up with a mouthful of gravel. Isn't that good? Food gained by fraud tastes sweet, but one ends up with a mouthful of gravel. I should tell that to my kids before they eat, before we've prayed every meal. No? Food gained by fraud tastes sweet, but one ends up with a mouthful of gravel. I want to explain this image for you because this is a powerful and important image for us as followers of Jesus, and this is what it was. Back in Solomon's day, they didn't have cash registers and they didn't have coins to purchase things. They didn't go to the store like you and I go to the store. A coin wasn't invented until 600 years before Jesus, 600 BC. So when you went to buy something, do you know what you bought things with? You bought things with pounds of grain and liters of olive oil. So if you wanted to go and buy a cow, you wouldn't give them money. You would give them 50 pounds of grain and 10 liters of olive oil. I have no idea if that's how much it is, but you kind of get the idea. You would actually pay other people in spices and grain and food so that you would be able to purchase. And when the store owner would stand there and he would want to weigh out your things, he would pull out his scales, he would set them on top of his counter, whatever counter they had, and he would weigh out the grain that you bought piece by piece. And in order to tell how much each pound of grain was, he would reach under the counter and he would grab a stone and he would put a stone. Why don't you put the scales up there, Gary? He would put a stone on one side of the scale and he would put your grain on the other and he would weigh out to see, is that exactly 1 pound or not? Or is this 2 pounds or 3 pounds? That's how commerce happened in Solomon's day. Except here's the thing that used to happen. When a store owner was standing there and he would watch a customer come in from the outside, he would kind of size them up and look at them and he would decide whether or not they were rich or whether they were poor. And if they were rich, he would reach for underneath. There would be a stone. There was a lighter stone and a heavier stone, and would reach for one or the other, depending on who walked through his doors. Does that make sense to you? He would reach for one stone that weighed more or one stone that weighed less to give a better price or a worse price, depending on the person who walked in. And he would treat differently each person, depending on how rich they thought they were. And this is why God says he hates dishonest scales, because we are not supposed to treat each other differently, regardless of how much money we make. Now, when you're picturing this story playing out, you might be sitting there thinking, well, that kind of makes sense. When the rich person walks in, he probably reaches for the heavier weight because the rich person can pay more, and he'll make the rich person pay more so he can gain a little more money. And if the poor person walks in, he'll reach for the lighter stone so that he won't have to pay as much because he doesn't have as much. But you know what? That's not how it happened back in the day. Do you know what used to happen? When a rich man used to walk in, he would reach for the lightweight and give him a better deal because he thought, he has all sorts of money and I want him to spend it all here. But when a poor man would walk through the door, a man who had just enough money to buy the food that he needed for that day, he would reach for the heavier rock and put it on one side, and he would gouge him for each and everything that he purchased. Does that sound fair to you? Can you picture that? See, if you were a poor man, not only did you make less money than your neighbor or than the wealthy man down the street, if you were poor, your money didn't even go as far. So even paying for the basic things of life were harder for you because you would get cheated out of every little bit, an ounce here, 2 ounces there. How does that make you feel? How would you feel if you watched a poor man walk in and spend the rest of the money he had to get not enough grain for him to eat that day? How would you feel? How many of you would be angry? When I hear that story inside of me, I start to feel something rise up. Do you know what that feeling is that you might be feeling? That's justice. That is a sense that something wrong is being done, and this is not okay, and this is not how God designed the world for us to live in. That something needs to be done about this. And this is why he says he hates dishonest scales. Now, we don't use scales anymore. Any of you use scales at work? Not unless you work at the bulk barn. We don't use scales. But we have all sorts of situations in today's day and age where we have ways of charging people different amounts of money or treating people differently depending on who they are, where they're from, or how much money they have. And so if you own your own business, what does this mean? If you own your own business, God is calling you to make sure that you are using honest scales with the people that you are working with. That you are not charging one price for this person and one price for that person depending on how much you like them or depending on how much you think you can get from them. I'm not saying that you can't use bulk discounts, but God is saying make sure that you conduct your business in such a way that you are using honest scales and you are not sizing up a person when they walk through the door. I used to work in sales, and we used to sit in one area of the room, and when somebody would walk through the door, we would size up the person who walked through based on how they walked, how they dressed, and what they looked like. And sometimes some of these salesmen would even decide how much they were going to charge this person for a TV based on what color or what quality their suit was when they walked through the door. Stuff like this happens all of the time these days. You ever driven by a loan center, Cash Money or Cash for Life, or wait, that's a lottery. Those loan centers that are usually bright yellow on the side of the street? If you're looking for dishonest scales, just walk in there and ask them how much they charge interest for somebody who can't get beyond paycheck to paycheck. Do you know how much it is? It starts with something like 10% for a few weeks on whatever you buy, and it goes as high as 1,000% per year if you cannot pay back each installment of the loan. The government has actually investigated, and so people who can't even get beyond paycheck to paycheck, they get stuck in this cycle of dishonest what? Scales. So God is calling all of us that when you are doing business, so much as it depends on you, make sure that you are running your business or clerking your store or doing the things that God has called you to for a living in such a way that you are being fair and equal to the people who come into your room, into your storefront, and into your office. Does that make sense? So not a lot of you don't own businesses, and some of you are sitting here thinking, I don't have much money at all. This isn't just about money. This is about relationships too. If you go into a high school and you just watch for about 10 minutes, you'll see all sorts of examples of dishonest scales, but it has nothing to do with money. You'll see people treating each other differently based on how popular they are or how good they are at sports. Most of us survived high school. We know what this was like. How much influence you had had everything to do with how good you looked, how popular you were, or how well you excelled in certain areas of life. There are all sorts of examples as followers of Jesus where we have scales for how we treat people. And Jesus, Solomon, he says this, he says, fix your scales. Make sure you treat the people in your life with an equal sense of fairness and justice. And it doesn't seem like a big deal when you treat one person like this and one person like that, but that has cumulative effects. It adds up, and it moves a society into a place where everybody treats each other dishonestly and unfairly, and we get to a world pretty close to the one that we live in now. And if it wasn't for a court system built on the laws of God many years ago, it would be even worse than it is today. So the first challenge for all of you and for me, if you want to be a person of justice, is this, is to fix your scales. The scales that you use to deal with people in life, whether it's by money or relationships, to fix them so that you deal with people on an even and a level playing field. The second thing that Solomon advises and calls us to is to listen. To listen for the cries of the oppressed around you. Proverbs 21:13, Solomon says this. He says, whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. It's a pretty hard proverb, isn't it? Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out at some point in time in their lives, but this time they will not be answered. I've always thought that was a bit of a funny phrase, shut their ears. Has anybody ever thought about that before? It's a bit of a funny phrase, a bit of a funny image to shut one's ears. How do we shut our ears? If you ask my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, this is how she shuts her ears. She actually walks around with 2 fingers in, or usually it's both palms to make sure mom and dad know that she's not listening when we're talking to her. And if I'm telling her to go and do a chore, she'll grab both hands and walk like this and walk out of the room, and she'll walk around like she didn't hear a word of what we said. Now, I don't think this is what Solomon is talking about in Proverbs 21. I think he's talking about something a little more nuanced than that. I think he's talking about something that we call selective hearing. How many of you in here have spouses with selective hearing? Maybe it's dangerous to put your hands up there. I saw a lot of this. How many of you here have someone in your family that they can hear everything you say all the way until it gets to this issue or that chore, and all of a sudden they're like, I'm sorry, what was that? I don't remember you saying that. I don't remember ever talking about that. This is actually part of what Solomon is talking about here, about selective hearing. You see, every single one of us is tuned in to hear certain things, and we have tuned out other things in our lives. We are tuned in to hear certain people, and we have tuned out other people in our lives. And I just remember this so clearly when we were young parents and Mel had Nate. She had superhuman hearing. New moms usually have this, but she had superhuman hearing. She could hear Nate crying 2 floors away and behind closed doors. And I don't know how she did it. No monitors necessary. She was just tuned to his cry. And I remember once we were sitting in a Bible study and it was loud and everybody was talking and a video was playing, and she turns to me and says, "Did you hear that?" And I say, "Hear what?" She said, "Nate, I think he's crying." And I'm like, there is no way you can hear that. But sure enough, she would go down the hall behind 2 locked doors or closed doors and open that, and Nate was crying. Now, why could she hear that? Not because she is a superhero. Why could she hear that? Because she was tuned into that frequency, and no matter what else that she was listening for, she was always leaving space to hear this from her child. Now, once you have 3 kids, you lose that sense of superhuman hearing. Once you have 3 kids, you sleep like the dead, and not even a hurricane could wake you up. And that's the scenario that at least I've graduated to. I don't know about Mel. But in those early stages, she could hear it because she was tuned into it. And I think what God is saying to this in this passage is that you and I, many of us have tuned out the cries of the oppressed. I hate to say this, but the truth is we have tuned it out because we have seen too many World Vision specials. We have seen too many sad things on the news. We have seen too many cries for help that have been distanced from us far enough that we have, in a sense, tuned out the cries of the poor and the oppressed around us, but we are tuned in so very well to the local sports scores and the NFL teams that we follow because we have chosen to listen to some things over the other. And what God is saying and Solomon is saying is this passage is make sure that you do not get to the place where you tune out the cries of the oppressed because they are calling out. And they are looking for someone to stand up for them. And they are looking for someone to go to bat for them. And if you don't hear them, then nothing else matters. You can't stick up for them and you can't fix it if you don't hear them first. Now, don't judge me here just for a second. I'll give you that as a preamble. Don't judge me. But at one point in time in our family, I asked Mel if she would mind if I bought earplugs and wore them around the house every once in a while. This is a true story. I just asked her if it would be okay with her for maybe 2 hours, 3 hours a day if I bought earplugs and I just used them as I was around the house because my house, when my kids get going, is louder than a gun range sometimes. And so I just wanted a little bit of peace. And she was horrified and she said, absolutely not, because then I wouldn't hear her calling. But she said, absolutely not. And to this day, I still think that that was a decent idea, but we're not going for it at our place. All God is asking you to do in this, and this is far harder than it sounds, all He's asking you to do is not to put earplugs in because the cries of the oppressed are out there. The cries of the poor and the disadvantaged are there, even in Canada, even in Dresden, even in this church, even in the friendship circles and the neighborhoods that you live in. All God is asking you to do is not to tune out those who are crying out for help, but to listen the way that He listens for them because one day He will listen to you. So you and I should be listening to them. Fix your scales. Listen for the cries of the oppressed. The third thing that you and I can do if we actually want to make a difference in this world and spread the sense of justice around is to share. Share with those in need. Let's read Proverbs 3:27 together. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Just leave that up there, Gary, for a second. The word good here in this passage, it is a Hebrew word that very specifically means things. It means stuff. So it's not just good words, it's not just good feelings or good vibes or whatever that means. It means do not withhold stuff and things from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Now, what Solomon is talking about here is about times in your life when you have extra and somebody that you know of has less. Financially or material, where God has blessed you with something and someone else that you know has less. And what he's saying is like this: when your neighbor gets laid off and they can't buy backpacks for their kids back to school, or if your neighbor gets laid off and their kids want to play sports but they just cannot afford to play sports, he says pay attention to those situations. And you and I actually have a calling as followers of Jesus to, when it is in our power to act, to do something about that situation. Now, anytime we talk about money, everybody gets just a little bit tighter. So if the temperature in the room drops just a little bit, I want you to bear with me. We're going to push through this. But God talks about money more than almost any other topic in the Bible, so we might as well talk about it too. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act. Now, I'm going to say something here that's going to push this even further for you, so strap in. This phrase, to those from those to whom it is due, the word in Hebrew is a single word, and the word means owners. The word means owners. So what Solomon is saying is, do not hold stuff from its owners when it is in your power to act. And what that actually means is, for those of us that have extra, when there are those around us who have less, they actually have somewhat of a claim on the extra that we have. Does that make sense? There's actually a claim. Now, we live in a free society, and God believes in free and responsible movement of capital. And he believes that when you and I have bank accounts, that nobody should come and take that from us. But what he's saying here is that when you have extra, those around you who do not have, sometimes there's a situation where they actually have a claim to some of the extra that you have. So what that really means is sometimes, let me say it this way, sometimes some of the extra that God has given you in one way actually belongs to those who don't have enough. Or to put it another way, he actually stored some of their blessing in your bank account. Let's just pause for a moment of silence here. I get how hard this is. I get this. Because you have worked hard for the money that you have been given. I believe most of you, unless you are like third generation super wealthy or you won the lottery, most of you have worked really hard for the goods that God has given you. But what he is saying here is super countercultural. It is still yours to steward and yours to give out, and you can decide yes or not. But in a sense, some of the money in your bank account, he has stored there for somebody else. This doesn't mean it's not yours to steward, but he actually stored some of their blessing in your bank account. Now, generosity is how we get back the things that God has given to its rightful owners. Do you remember when we were talking about spiritual gifts? That sometimes God has put grace in your life that he meant for somebody else? Materially, this is partially true as well. Sometimes there is provision in your life that he actually meant for somebody else. And generosity is how we get it back to the person that God had meant it for. Now, one of the things that I love about this church is I really believe that so many of you in this room, you get this. So many of you in this room have a bursting and a generous heart. We have sent 3 different mission teams in the last 5 years out of this building, and every one of those missions teams went over here with more money than they needed to complete the task. Every single one. This church, for missions alone and missions teams alone, it was somewhere close to $175,000 was raised for 3 different missions teams to go over 3 years. Right behind this wall here and through this door is a food bank. Do you know how many people get fed through that food bank every single month? More than 50 people come through here every month from the Dresden area and are fed because of the faithfulness of this church and the churches in this area, and the faithfulness of those of you who come in here to volunteer. And those 50 people represent 100 to 150 other people if you add in all of the kids and the relatives, and every single month, over and over again, this happens. I really believe that you as a church, many of you get this generosity thing. And I think that God is encouraging you and working in you, and my only advice to you is to keep it up. To keep giving and keep being generous, because God has called us to be generous. Generosity is actually a part of justice, where we make right inequity that is in the world that we live in right now. Giving is one of the primary ways that we fix what's broken in our world. So just ask God to give you a generous heart, not begrudgingly, not clawing as you give, but generously and open-handedly give. Ask him to show you where in your life there is somebody who has less, not for a fault of their own, who actually has less, and He might be calling you to give, to bring them to a place where they can find blessing that they wouldn't have had before. See, generosity isn't just a thing that we do on Sunday mornings. It's this way of taking back the ground that sin and injustice have taken from us, and by building God's kingdom of justice and making it spread forward throughout every generation. It's a way of setting things right again. The last thing that Solomon calls us to in this, when it comes to justice and injustice, is to speak. To speak up for those who don't have a voice. Now, this is the one that really got to me this week. The more I thought about it, the more it hit me, and the more I started to think of situations that I had been in and stories that I had been a part of or seen where this was true. And one of the greatest things that every one of you in this room, one of the greatest things that you can do to maintain and to build a sense of justice in the world is to actually speak up for those who don't have a voice, to be their voice when they simply cannot say what they need to say. Listen to King Lemuel in 31, 8-9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Several times he says the same thing. He says, speak up. Speak up. You see, in our society today, the more money you have and the more influence you have, the more voice you seem to carry. How many of you know that's true? The more money you have, the more influence you have, or the more famous you are, the more your voice seems to carry, and the more that people generally will listen to you. If you have 100 million followers on Instagram, people will listen to you more than me, who have 0, right? Like, it's just a basic law of relationships. And the more money you have, billionaires, when they say something, people listen. Even rock stars. Why does anybody listen to rock stars? Rock stars say things and everybody listens, other than you two, right? The more money you have, the more popular you are, the more voice you have. The problem is that wealthy people, they tend to do better in court than poorer people do. People with connections, they tend to get better jobs than those who don't, and so the world is not evenly laid. There are inequities all over the place, and there are many people, those who can't afford it, sometimes never make it even into the courtroom, and they simply don't have a voice because of the place that they have been put in the world that they live in. This isn't just about money. I want to say that again, this whole thing isn't just about money, but it absolutely has to do with money. It is about relationships and connection between people. It is how we treat the world around us. And socially, there are some people that are so far on the outside in high school or in college or in your friendship groups that they just don't have a voice to speak. I just want to leave you today with one story that really hit home for me, and maybe it'll hit home for you. About a year or two ago, I got a call from a relative that I didn't know about, and he said that he was going to be in London on business and he wanted to meet me at a restaurant. I was a little nervous when I got that call because most spy movies I've ever seen start something like that. So I just wasn't sure what to expect. He gave me a description of who he was, and I had to go to this restaurant at this time and look for a guy that looked like this. He wasn't wearing a rose or anything, but this is just how this story started. And he had the same last name as me, so I decided to meet him in London, and we went about a couple of years ago. And we sat down at the table, and he turned out to be really one of my cousins, one of my long-lost choiring cousins. There's not a lot of us, so this is kind of a big deal. And he sat down with me, and he started to tell me about stories of the old country, and he was trying to build a family tree and trying to figure out all the gaps that were in all the information. My father and my whole father's family came from Russia, and so much of their back history is not known. And we sat there literally drawing a family tree and trying to figure out where he came from, where I came from, and how we were related, and all the way up we went. He told me the story about his great-grandfather that I will never forget for the rest of my life. His great-grandfather was growing up in Russia, and this was many years ago, and it was a poor part of Russia. And back then, the KGB could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Maybe back then is the wrong phrase. Even now, the KGB can do pretty much whatever it wants. But back then, it was true even more so than now, and life in Russia was hard. And one day, the KGB showed up for my great-grand-uncle. They questioned him for a little bit, and he never came back again. They literally just picked him up for questioning. He never returned back to his family. So instantly, we don't know why it happened, whether this was because he was a Christian or what, whether he had spoken out against the party, but they took him away for questioning, and he never came back. And in an instant, this entire family lost a father, lost a husband, and lost a breadwinner. So when you grow up on a farm, it's the next man up, right? When you grow up on a farm, it's the next man up or everybody starves. So the next man up was the 11-year-old boy or so that was my great-grand-uncle, and it was his job to see things through as a family and take care of the rest of the flock. So he would go and do what he could, and that summer or that winter and the winter after that, the family nearly starved because there was not enough grain to go around. It was just enough to keep them alive, and they had 1 cow to milk. Just enough grain to make it through that year and 1 cow to milk. And he told me the story about how when that young boy used to go, and I'm not sure why this happened, but he used to take the milk that they would get from the cow and they had to run it through a machine. I'm not sure if there was something wrong with the milk or they had to separate out the different elements of it, but he had to go and take it all the time to a machine in the local village. And when they were in this room together and they were running the milk through the machine, the problem with the machine was you had to prime the machine with a whole bunch of liquid. Do you all know what priming is? You have to pour a whole bunch of liquid into a machine just to get it running that you don't ever actually get back again. And whenever they would get together like this, they would look around the room and they would find the young boy in a room full of men and they would push him to the front of the line. And he would take the milk that he had for his starving family. They would make him pour it into the machine first to prime the machine, and then the rest of the men from the other farms would go. Every time he would go, they would push him to the front of the line, this tiny little boy who couldn't speak for himself, who was too poor to say anything, who had nobody to defend him, nobody to stick up for him. They would push him to the front of the line and make him pour it in. And by the time he got home usually with about half the milk that he went with in the first place because of the way that the rest of the men in the village treated him. How does that make you feel? Does that make you angry? It makes me angry. Does that feel wrong to you? It's because it is. Every time that would happen. And when I picture this situation playing out and I read this verse that we had up on the screen there just a moment ago, what I picture my great-granduncle standing in line there. Every time he comes, trying to hide at the back of the line so that nobody would notice him. And I picture them pushing him forward. And all the while this is happening, he is looking around the room for somebody to say something. He is looking for somebody to say something. Somebody to say, hey guys, this isn't right. Somebody to say, let's at least take turns. Let's share the burden of this. Somebody to stick up for a boy who did not have a voice, who is being taken advantage of. Somebody to stick up and say, guys, let's find another way of doing this because this isn't right. Do you know what? In your life, it may not be as serious as that, but in your life, there are people just like this young boy who are looking around for somebody to say something. They are looking around for somebody to be their voice, for somebody to stick up for them. And God is saying, Solomon is saying in this passage here, that somebody, that could be you. That kid that gets picked on all the time at school, that could be you. That guy at work that always gets passed over and left out of everything, that actually could be you. That family that is in need and you know of people that could help him, that could be you, because God has called us to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to be a voice for those that don't have one. And this is what justice looks like. So my challenge for you today is fairly simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. I want you to look around your life. I want you to look around the world that you live in right now and forget about those news stories just for a second. Forget about all the things that seem beyond your ability to control, and think about the call that God has made on you this morning to be a person of justice. Think about where in your life God might want you to fix your scales. Where might He want you to unstop your ears and listen for the cries of those around you who are calling out that you haven't been able to hear up until now. Where He might be calling you to share with those who have less than you. Or where He might be calling you to speak up for somebody who just does not have a voice. If you are willing to do this in the sphere of influence that God has put you in, justice will gain ground with every single act of obedience. And the kingdom of God, it will be one step closer to the world that He is remaking when Jesus comes again. Amen? Let's pray.